Here's the rewritten version in a reusable draft format. The first time Marcus brushed aside my opinion about business, I was 19 years old. He was already several years older and riding high on the excitement of landing a major contract for the logistics company he had just launched. We were gathered at our father's retirement dinner, and Marcus spent nearly the entire evening explaining his plans, his growth projections, and why his company was destined for success. I sat quietly, listening while finishing my meal. At one point Dad looked toward me and asked what I thought. Maybe he genuinely wanted my input, or maybe he was simply trying to include everyone in the conversation. I answered carefully. I said the pricing model seemed solid, but suggested building a larger cash reserve before expanding the fleet, especially if fuel prices rose unexpectedly. Marcus laughed before I could finish. "Stick to your college courses, Ratch," he said. "Business strategy isn't something you learn in an introductory economics class." The table laughed with him. I lowered my eyes and returned to my dinner. 14 years passed, but very little changed. Marcus transformed Martech Logistics from a tiny operation with a handful of trucks into a company that he proudly described as an empire. He constantly reminded everyone about the size of the business, the hundreds of employees, the offices spread across multiple states, and the success he had achieved. Meanwhile, I operated a small financial consulting company from a modest office in downtown Seattle. I advised growing businesses on strategy, funding, and capital management. My firm had only a few employees and generated respectable profits, but to Marcus it was little more than a hobby. At every family gathering he found a way to mention it. "Still doing consulting?" he'd ask with a smile that felt more insulting than curious. The truth was something no one in my family knew. By 25, I had earned my first $10 million through carefully chosen technology investments. Over the following years, I multiplied that wealth through disciplined portfolio management, angel investments, and an early position in a cloud infrastructure startup that eventually went public at a massive valuation. I never talked about it. I lived comfortably but quietly. My consulting firm was legitimate, but it wasn't my primary source of income. Most of my time was spent managing investments and acting as a silent partner in several rapidly growing companies. One of those companies belonged to Marcus. 8 years earlier, Martech Logistics had been standing on the edge of disaster. Marcus had expanded aggressively. Debt piled up. Credit lines were stretched thin. Expansion costs threatened to crush the company before it could reach profitability. To survive, the business needed a massive injection of capital. $180 million. Banks quietly searched for investors willing to take the risk. Through a network of investment entities created by my legal team, I became that investor. The agreement was simple. I provided the capital. I remained anonymous. I received a strong return and a strategic advisory position delivered through intermediaries. Marcus never knew where the guidance originated. For 8 years I watched him grow his company using money I had provided while listening to him explain, over and over again, that I didn't understand how business worked. Then came the family gathering that changed everything. Marcus invited 18 relatives to his Bellevue estate for what he called a major announcement. The house itself looked like a luxury magazine cover. Catered food filled the tables. Expensive wine flowed freely. Everyone was excited before the evening even started. Marcus stood at the center of the room like a CEO preparing to address investors. "I have incredible news," he announced. The room immediately focused on him. He explained that multiple firms were interested in acquiring Martech Logistics. According to him, discussions placed the company's valuation somewhere between $850 million and $1.1 billion. The room exploded with applause. Dad looked prouder than I'd ever seen him. Mom wiped tears from her eyes. Marcus's wife recorded every second on her phone. Marcus continued speaking, describing years of vision, risk-taking, and leadership. He talked about understanding leverage, timing, and growth better than anyone else. I listened quietly while sipping my wine. Then he revealed what he considered the best part. The sale, he claimed, would make him worth somewhere between $600 and $750 million. More cheers followed. A cousin raised his glass and declared Marcus the family's future billionaire. Everyone celebrated. Everyone except me. Because unlike everyone else in that room, I knew the actual numbers. I knew the debt obligations. I knew the ownership structure. And most importantly, I knew about the investor who controlled a majority position in the company. Marcus's personal stake wasn't even close to what he claimed. As the applause faded, he finally noticed my silence. "Rachel, you're awfully quiet." His familiar smile appeared. "No congratulations." I congratulated him politely. That should have been enough. Instead, Marcus pushed further. "You should pay attention," he said. "This is what real business building looks like. Not consulting contracts. Not small projects. Real scale." A few relatives laughed. I remained calm. "I'm familiar with capital markets." Marcus grinned. "Sure. How's that little consulting office doing these days?" "It's doing fine." He turned toward the room. "Rachel does okay. Nothing wrong with that. Some people think small. Others build empires." The comment drew more laughter. For the first time that evening, I interrupted him. "Marcus, maybe we should discuss your capital structure." The room instantly fell silent. His expression tightened. "What are you talking about?" "Your debt ratio. Investor positions. Actual ownership percentages. Those details." Marcus forced a smile. "I don't think anyone wants a finance lecture during a celebration." I set my glass down. "The problem is that the numbers you're presenting don't match reality." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Every eye in the room shifted between us. "If you're claiming $600 to $750 million in personal equity," I continued evenly, "then either you're overstating your ownership position or you're ignoring major financial obligations." The atmosphere changed immediately. Marcus's face flushed red. The confidence he'd displayed all evening began to crack. For the first time, he wasn't controlling the conversation. For the first time, someone in the room understood the company better than he did. And for the first time in 14 years, the family wasn't laughing at me. Marcus stared across the room, anger barely contained behind a forced smile. Then he delivered the same response he'd been giving me since I was 19 years old. "Stick to your little side projects, Rachel," he snapped. "Real business is beyond you." What he still didn't realize was that the empire he was bragging about had survived because of me. The company he called his masterpiece had been built on my $180 million investment. And before the night was over, everyone in that room was about to learn exactly who had really been pulling the strings all along. Here's the rewritten continuation that flows directly from the previous section. Yet Marcus wasn't finished. He leaned forward, clearly irritated that I had challenged him in front of an audience. "This isn't some small consulting assignment, Rachel," he said. "We're talking about high-level corporate finance. Acquisition negotiations. Billion-dollar valuations. You wouldn't understand the complexity involved." I nodded calmly. "I understand." "No, you don't," he fired back immediately. Frustration was creeping into his voice now. "You've never built a company at this scale. You've never managed real money. You've never had to make decisions that affect hundreds of employees." Then he shook his head and laughed. "I love you, but you're embarrassing yourself trying to explain my own business to me. These discussions involve Fortune 500 companies. This is a completely different level." Before I could answer, Dad stepped in. "Marcus has a point, sweetheart. Let's not get into technical discussions tonight. This is a celebration." The conversation moved on, and I simply smiled before taking another sip of wine. A few moments later, my phone vibrated. I glanced down at the screen. The message was from Theodore Chin, the financial advisor who had quietly managed communications between me and Martech Logistics for nearly a decade. Need to speak with you immediately. I excused myself and stepped away from the gathering. The moment I called him, he answered. Rachel, thank you for returning my call. You sounded concerned. I've been reviewing information related to the acquisition discussions. Marcus appears to be making statements that suggest he doesn't fully understand the company's ownership structure. I couldn't help smiling. What exactly has he misunderstood? The valuation numbers he's presenting don't align with reality. I leaned against the hallway wall. He's telling everyone the company is worth between $850 million and $1.1 billion. He also believes his personal stake will be worth somewhere around $600 to $750 million. Theodore went silent for a moment. Then he sighed. You know that's impossible. I do. Based on the actual structure, you control 51% through the investment entities. At those valuation levels, your position would represent the largest share of the proceeds. Marcus's ownership, after accounting for debt obligations and other liabilities, would be dramatically lower than what he's claiming. The irony wasn't lost on me. For years Marcus had lectured me about business while remaining completely unaware of who had rescued his company when it was on the verge of collapse. He still doesn't know, does he? Theodore asked. No. Not even a suspicion. None. Theodore chuckled softly. All these years he believed the silent partner was some anonymous institutional group. That's what we intended. Well, that anonymity won't survive much longer. His tone became more serious. The acquisition interest is legitimate. If negotiations continue, due diligence will eventually reveal every ownership position. Within a matter of weeks, Marcus will discover that his younger sister owns the majority of the company he spent years bragging about. I looked through the window toward the living room. Marcus was still standing in the center of the crowd, soaking up admiration. How long before everything becomes public? Possibly 60 days. I considered that for a moment. Then Theodore spoke again. Can I be honest with you? Of course. I've watched this situation for 8 years. I've watched you provide the financial foundation that allowed Martech Logistics to survive. I've watched you offer strategic guidance through intermediaries while your brother took full credit for every success. And every time I attended a meeting or reviewed correspondence, I knew the truth. I remained silent. The question is whether you're ready for what happens next. What do you mean? When Marcus learns who actually controls the majority interest, the fallout will be significant. I stared at the crowd gathered around him. For years I had chosen patience. For years I had remained invisible. For years I had allowed him to underestimate me. Suddenly, I felt exhausted by it. Theodore, I said quietly, I think it's time. His voice lowered. Time for what? I want to exercise my withdrawal rights. The line went silent. Several seconds passed before he responded. You're certain? Yes. You understand what that triggers? I do. A formal withdrawal would force Marcus into a decision. He would either need to purchase my ownership position at fair market value, accelerate a company sale, or secure replacement financing under far less favorable conditions. Given the debt burden already sitting on the company, I knew exactly how difficult that would be. What changed? Theodore asked. I looked back toward the celebration. Marcus was laughing. Family members were applauding. Everyone was congratulating him for building an empire entirely on his own. I'm tired of watching someone stand on a foundation I created while pretending I contributed nothing. Theodore didn't argue. When should I begin? Immediately. Then the notice can be filed Monday morning. Do it. He hesitated. This will likely end whatever relationship remains between you and your brother. I thought about that. Then I realized something. There wasn't much left to lose. A relationship requires mutual respect, I said. What we've had is dependency disguised as superiority. Theodore understood. I'll prepare everything tonight. Before ending the call, he added one final detail. Once Marcus receives notice, he'll almost certainly request a meeting with the silent partner. For years I've hidden behind paperwork and intermediaries. Not anymore. You want him to know? Yes. When he asks who owns 51% of his company, tell him the truth. I ended the call and returned to the party. Nothing appeared different. Marcus continued entertaining relatives with stories of growth and expansion. The family continued celebrating. Nobody had any idea that the future of Martech Logistics had just changed forever. 3 hours later, I left quietly. Marcus barely noticed. The weekend passed quickly. Lawyers finalized documents. Signatures were collected. Every detail was reviewed and approved. Then Monday arrived. At precisely 9:47 in the morning, Martech Logistics received formal notice. The majority stakeholder was exercising withdrawal rights under the original investment agreement. The company now faced a countdown. Marcus had limited time to respond. He could attempt a buyout. He could accelerate acquisition negotiations. Or he could somehow replace the largest investor in company history. The moment his legal team explained the implications, chaos followed. My phone started ringing. Once. Twice. Then over and over again. Calls came every few minutes. I ignored every one of them. Instead, I followed my normal routine. Coffee. Emails. Market reviews. Portfolio updates. By early afternoon, Theodore called again. Marcus knows about the ownership structure now. I wasn't surprised. How is he handling it? Poorly. I laughed. What happened? He demanded an emergency meeting with the silent partner. Of course he did. He still doesn't know it's you. He only knows that someone owns a controlling interest and intends to withdraw. I checked my calendar. Schedule the meeting for Wednesday morning. 10 o'clock. I'll let him know. There was a pause. Should I reveal your identity beforehand? I looked out the window and smiled. No. You're certain? Absolutely. Theodore laughed softly. That will be one memorable meeting. Tuesday was strangely quiet. At least externally. Internally, I knew Marcus was unraveling. My phone showed dozens of missed calls. His messages evolved throughout the day. At first he sounded confused, demanding answers and asking who the silent partner was. Later, the messages turned hostile, accusing unknown investors of sabotage and threatening legal action. By evening, the tone shifted once again. The anger disappeared. Desperation replaced it. And for the first time in 14 years, Marcus was searching for answers instead of pretending he already had them. Here's the rewritten continuation, designed to connect seamlessly with the previous section and maintain the same narrative flow. Late Tuesday night, after hours of unanswered calls and increasingly desperate messages, I finally sent a response. Just one sentence. Wednesday. 10 o'clock. My office. The silent partner will be there. Nothing else. No explanations. No hints. No warnings. By then, Marcus had spent nearly 2 full days trying to identify the person who held control over the company he believed was entirely his. Wednesday arrived with a strange sense of calm. I reached my office before sunrise had fully burned through the morning clouds. Sarah had already cleared my schedule and ensured there would be no interruptions. Everything was prepared. At 9:45, Theodore arrived carrying several folders containing 8 years of agreements, ownership records, investment documents, and correspondence. The evidence of a truth that had remained hidden for nearly a decade. 13 minutes later, Marcus pulled into the parking lot. He wasn't alone. A corporate attorney stepped out beside him. I recognized David Brenner immediately. Neither of them looked happy. More importantly, neither of them looked prepared for what they were about to discover. Sarah escorted them into the conference room. I waited until the clock reached exactly 10 before entering alongside Theodore. The moment Marcus saw me, confusion crossed his face. Then recognition. Then uncertainty. And finally something much darker. A realization that he couldn't quite process. Rachel? He looked around the room. What are you doing here? His eyes moved toward Theodore. Then back to me. Where's the silent partner? I took the seat directly across from him. You're looking at her. The room became completely silent. Marcus blinked. Then laughed. A short, nervous laugh. Very funny. I'm serious. The smile vanished. I slid a folder across the table. Inside were ownership records, partnership agreements, LLC structures, investment transfers, and legal documentation tracing everything back to me. David immediately opened the file. His expression changed with every page. Marcus watched him. Then looked back at me. No. His voice sounded weak. No, that's impossible. I remained calm. It's all there. You don't have this kind of money. His disbelief was genuine. You run a consulting business. A consulting business that was never my primary source of income. For the next several minutes, I explained what I had never bothered explaining to anyone in my family. The technology investments. The startup funding. The private equity positions. The companies that had succeeded. The portfolio that had grown year after year. The capital that eventually gave me the ability to invest $180 million when Martech Logistics was on the verge of collapse. Marcus sat frozen. The version of me he had created in his mind was falling apart piece by piece. The bank told me institutional investors saved the company. They told you exactly what they were instructed to tell you. The investor group didn't exist. His eyes widened. Theodore represented me under the anonymity agreement. Every communication, every recommendation, every strategic suggestion came through that structure. Marcus turned toward Theodore. Theodore simply nodded. It was confirmation he couldn't argue with. For several moments nobody spoke. Then Marcus leaned back in his chair as though the weight of the truth had suddenly become physical. 8 years. His voice barely carried across the room. 8 years. I said nothing. You owned most of the company this entire time. Yes. And you never told me. The question wasn't angry. Not yet. It sounded wounded. I didn't invest because I wanted recognition. I held his gaze. I invested because you were my brother. The room remained quiet. You needed help. Your company was running out of options. Banks were pulling back. Credit was drying up. The business was heading toward bankruptcy. His eyes dropped to the table. I knew. I believed the company could survive. I believed in the opportunity. So I provided the capital. And then hid it. Because I didn't want you feeling indebted to your younger sister. A bitter laugh escaped him. The irony is unbelievable. It probably is. He shook his head slowly. I spent years thinking I built this myself. You built a great deal of it yourself. His eyes snapped upward. But not all of it. No. The distinction mattered. Marcus had worked hard. He had built operations. Managed employees. Expanded markets. Solved problems. But none of it would have happened without the capital that kept the doors open when everything was collapsing. Eventually his attention shifted to the present. Why withdraw now? I already knew that question was coming. The answer hasn't changed. He waited. For years you've dismissed me. Every family gathering became another opportunity to remind everyone how little respect you had for my experience. His jaw tightened. That's not fair. It is. I leaned forward. You told me real business was beyond me. You said it again last weekend. Before that, you said versions of the same thing for more than a decade. Marcus looked away. For the first time, there was no comeback. No joke. No lecture. Nothing. David finally broke the silence. Marcus, we need to focus on the options available. The attorney opened a folder. His tone was professional. Given the ownership percentages and existing liabilities, purchasing Rachel's position isn't realistic. Marcus didn't respond. Securing replacement capital within the contractual timeline is equally unlikely. Still silence. Which leaves the acquisition. The words hung in the room. The acquisition. The very deal Marcus had celebrated days earlier. Only now the numbers looked very different. Not because the company had changed. But because reality had entered the conversation. If the acquisition proceeds, David continued, ownership percentages determine proceeds. Marcus closed his eyes. He already understood. The company's sale that he believed would crown him the family's first billionaire would instead reveal that he was not even the majority owner. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a mixture of disbelief and resignation. So everyone finds out. Eventually. My executives. Yes. My friends. Yes. My employees. I nodded. There won't be any way to hide it during due diligence. Marcus rubbed his forehead. The confidence that had filled his mansion days earlier was gone. In its place sat a man confronting facts he could no longer ignore. Then he looked directly at me. Tell me honestly. I waited. If you were willing to stay hidden for 8 years, why reveal yourself now? The answer came easily. Because I had been asking myself the same question for months. I'm not exposing you. He frowned. I stopped hiding myself. The distinction landed harder than anything else I'd said. For years I had accepted being underestimated. Accepted the jokes. Accepted the assumptions. Accepted being treated like someone whose opinions carried no weight. Not anymore. Marcus stared at me for several seconds. Then Theodore spoke quietly from the end of the table. There is something else you should know. Marcus looked toward him. The strategic initiatives that transformed Martech over the last 8 years weren't accidental. A look of confusion crossed his face. The fleet automation project. Theodore paused. The expansion sequencing. Another pause. The software integration strategy. Marcus slowly turned toward me. And for the first time since entering the room, genuine understanding began appearing behind his eyes. Because he was finally realizing that the silent partner hadn't just financed his success. She had been helping shape it all along. Here's the rewritten continuation that seamlessly follows the previous section. The realization hit Marcus like a freight train. For years, he had assumed those recommendations came from analysts, consultants, and advisors working behind the scenes. He believed they were the product of research teams and industry experts hired to guide the company forward. Now he was discovering they had come from me. His eyes widened as memories began connecting themselves. The Fleet Automation Initiative. He said slowly. I nodded. Yes. His expression changed. 3 years ago, at Dad's birthday party, I remember telling you automation was overrated. I said it was a trend pushed by people who didn't understand logistics. You did. Marcus looked down at the table. And then a few weeks later Theodore recommended it. I gave a small smile. You assumed the idea was his. Theodore folded his hands. It wasn't. Marcus exhaled heavily. That project reduced operating costs dramatically. Over $20 million annually. The room fell silent again. Then another memory surfaced. The software platform. I could see him putting the pieces together. Thanksgiving. I nodded once more. You said developing proprietary software was a waste of money. And then suddenly it became one of our highest priorities. Because it was the right move. Marcus stared at me. That system became one of the biggest reasons buyers became interested in us. It created a competitive advantage your competitors couldn't easily replicate. The weight of the truth continued settling over him. One revelation after another. One assumption collapsing after another. He slowly shook his head. Was all of it you? Not all of it. I wasn't interested in rewriting history. Marcus deserved credit where credit was due. You built the teams. You managed operations. You cultivated client relationships and handled execution. You're exceptionally good at those things. But the growth strategy. A lot of that came from me. The expansion sequencing. Me. The capital allocation decisions. Mostly me. The positioning that attracted acquisition interest. Also me. Marcus sat back in his chair and stared at the ceiling for several seconds. The silence wasn't hostile anymore. It felt reflective. Almost painful. Finally he looked at me again. So what exactly do you want? The question carried none of the arrogance it once would have. No mockery. No condescension. Just honesty. I appreciated that. I want transparency. He listened carefully. I want our business relationship to reflect reality. I folded my hands on the table. The acquisition process continues. We both participate. We negotiate together. We receive proceeds based on ownership percentages. Marcus nodded slowly. And I want the dismissive behavior to stop. His eyes dropped. You've spent years treating my experience as if it had no value. I paused. The irony is that I've been demonstrating that value the entire time. David cleared his throat. The attorney had been reviewing documents and listening quietly. Marcus, from a legal and financial standpoint, cooperation is the best possible outcome. Marcus looked toward him. The agreement is enforceable. Rachel has every right to proceed exactly as she has. Any attempt to challenge it would likely damage the acquisition and potentially reduce the company's value. The attorney closed his folder. The practical solution is partnership. Marcus nodded without argument. Then he looked back at me. For the first time in my life, I saw something in his expression I had never seen before. Respect. Not complete acceptance. Not complete peace. But respect. Mixed with embarrassment. Mixed with regret. Mixed with the realization that his understanding of our relationship had been wrong for a very long time. The family is going to learn all of this. Yes. My employees too. Eventually. My friends. Probably. He laughed quietly. There wasn't much humor in it. They're going to find out that I spent years bragging about a company where I wasn't even the majority owner. I didn't soften the truth. Yes. And they're going to discover that my younger sister knew more about strategic finance than I did. Most likely. He rubbed his face. Then something unexpected happened. The defensiveness disappeared completely. I've treated you terribly. I didn't respond. Because we both knew it was true. For 14 years, every family gathering had included some version of the same dynamic. Marcus speaking. Everyone listening. Me offering a thought. Marcus dismissing it. The pattern had become so normal that nobody questioned it. Until now. I'm sorry. The words were simple. But they felt genuine. I should have listened. He swallowed hard. I should have respected your opinions. The room remained quiet. I was arrogant. He finally looked directly into my eyes. The truth is that I never bothered finding out who you really were. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then I answered. You built something valuable, Marcus. His eyebrows lifted slightly. I did. Yes. I wasn't interested in destroying him. That had never been the goal. You created a successful company. You worked hard. You took risks. You built relationships and solved problems. I leaned forward slightly. But you didn't do it alone. His shoulders relaxed. And for the first time that morning, he accepted the truth instead of fighting it. Okay. The word came out quietly. Then he nodded. We moved forward together. I waited. We continue the acquisition process. Another nod. We disclose the ownership structure. He inhaled deeply. And we tell the truth. I smiled. That's all I wanted. David immediately began drafting the necessary amendments. Over the next 2 hours, we worked through every remaining issue. The withdrawal notice would be suspended. The acquisition process would continue uninterrupted. Both of us would participate in negotiations. Both of us would be represented equally. And when due diligence began, there would be no secrets. By early afternoon, the paperwork was complete. As Marcus prepared to leave, he paused near the door. One final question lingered in his mind. The automation strategy. I looked up. Yes. How did you know it would work so well? I smiled. Because I'd invested in multiple logistics companies that implemented similar systems years earlier. His eyes widened. You already had the data. Exactly. And the software platform? I invested in the development firm before you ever hired them. Marcus laughed softly. Not because anything was funny. Because the answer suddenly explained everything. So while I thought you were running a tiny consulting company, you thought wrong. He shook his head. Then he smiled for the first time all day. I spent years underestimating you. That's more accurate than calling yourself an idiot. He nodded. Fair enough. After Marcus and David left, Theodore remained behind. The conference room finally felt quiet. He looked at me thoughtfully. That could have gone much worse. It could have. I expected anger. So did I. Theodore smiled. Instead, you gave him a chance. I looked through the conference room window toward the city skyline. I wasn't trying to punish him. No. I shook my head. I wanted him to see reality. There was a difference. Humiliation would have been easy. Public revenge would have been easy. What mattered was recognition. Being seen clearly after years of being ignored. Over the next 3 months, the acquisition moved forward exactly as planned. Marcus and I attended meetings together. For the first time, we sat on the same side of the table as genuine partners. The acquiring company conducted an exhaustive review of the business. Every contract, every financial statement, every ownership document was examined. When they discovered the unusual ownership structure, they weren't concerned. If anything, they were impressed. The arrangement demonstrated long-term planning, disciplined investment strategy, and unusual patience. In the end, the company received a final valuation of $980 million. The numbers were staggering. My ownership stake translated into just under $500 million before taxes. Marcus's share exceeded $370 million. The employee equity program rewarded dozens of people who had helped build the company. Everyone benefited. The acquisition announcement identified both of us as key contributors to Martech's success. For the first time, the public story matched the truth. And before long, the truth reached our family as well. The first call came from Mom. Her voice was filled with confusion, surprise, and disbelief. "Rachel," she said, "I just read the acquisition announcement." I smiled. "I figured you would." There was a long pause. Then came the question I knew was coming. "Sweetheart, how exactly did you end up owning most of your brother's company?" Here's the rewritten final continuation, flowing naturally from the previous section. I leaned back in my chair and let the question hang for a moment before answering. "By investing when everyone else was pulling away." Mom was silent. Then another question came almost immediately. "But why didn't you tell us?" I couldn't help smiling. "Would any of you have believed me?" The silence on the other end of the line gave me my answer. For years, Marcus dismissed every piece of advice I offered. Dad usually sided with him. Eventually I stopped trying to convince people with words and started letting results speak for themselves. Mom struggled to process it all. "The announcement says you earned more from the sale than Marcus." "That's because I owned a larger share of the company." "But he's taking it hard." I looked out the window. He spent 14 years assuming he was the smartest person in every room. Discovering that reality is different was never going to be easy. There was a pause. Then Mom said something that didn't surprise me. "You could have handled it more gently." I considered that. Maybe she was right. Maybe there had been other ways. But there was one thing she wasn't seeing. For 8 years I supported him without asking for credit. I accepted lower returns than most investors would have demanded. I stayed anonymous. I protected his pride. I exhaled slowly. The surprise wasn't created by me. It was created by the assumptions he chose to make. Mom sighed. "You sound angry." "No." I answered honestly. "I'm just done pretending." A week later, Dad called and asked if we could meet. When I arrived at the coffee shop, he got straight to the point. "I owe you an apology." The words caught me off guard. Dad wasn't a man who apologized often. "I spent years looking at the situation completely wrong," he continued. "I thought Marcus was the business genius in the family." I stayed quiet. "The truth is, both of you built something extraordinary. He created the company. You made its survival possible." For the first time, I could hear genuine regret in his voice. "We treated you like your opinions carried less weight." I nodded slowly. "Thank you for saying that." He stared into his coffee for a moment. "How did none of us know?" "Because nobody was looking." He frowned. "What does that mean?" "You all saw what you expected to see." I shrugged. A woman with a small consulting firm. A quiet life. A modest office. And that wasn't the full picture. Not even close. The reality was simple. While everyone focused on appearances, I focused on building assets. While Marcus built visibility, I built ownership. While others chased recognition, I concentrated on results. Dad sat back and shook his head. "Marcus told me you could have forced a liquidation." "I could have. And instead, you structured everything so he still walked away with hundreds of millions." "Because I never wanted to destroy him." That was the part people kept missing. Revenge had never been the objective. Humiliation wasn't the goal. "I wanted acknowledgement," I said. "Nothing more." Dad nodded. "He sees you now." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he added quietly. "So do the rest of us." The transaction closed later that year. After taxes, my share increased my portfolio substantially, pushing it beyond anything I had imagined when I was 19 years old sitting quietly at that retirement dinner. Marcus also walked away with an extraordinary outcome. More money than most people could earn in several lifetimes. Enough to start over. Enough to build again. And that's exactly what he did. Today, we're not especially close. We're polite, professional, respectful. The relationship is different now. Less comfortable perhaps, but far more honest. Marcus has launched another company. This time in logistics technology. He's building it without hidden investors and without assumptions about who understands business and who doesn't. As for me, I continue investing, advising founders, and helping promising companies grow. The difference is that I no longer hide behind anonymity. My name is attached to my work. My reputation stands beside my results. Sometimes people ask whether I regret waiting so long to reveal the truth. And occasionally I wonder about it myself. Maybe I could have told Marcus years earlier. Maybe I could have forced the conversation before it reached a breaking point. Maybe. But then I remember that night at his house. The confidence. The laughter. The certainty. The way he looked at me and said that real business was beyond me. He said it to the person who had rescued his company when nobody else would. He said it to the investor who owned the majority stake. He said it to the strategist behind many of the decisions that helped create his success. And in that moment, I realized something important. Sometimes the greatest favor you can do for someone is stop protecting them from the truth. I didn't take anything away from my brother. I simply revealed what had always been there. The support. The partnership. The reality beneath the story he had chosen to believe. For years, I stayed invisible because I thought helping mattered more than recognition. Eventually, I learned that being invisible comes with a cost. People start confusing silence with weakness. They mistake humility for lack of ability. They assume absence of credit means absence of contribution. I don't make that mistake anymore. Neither does Marcus. And neither does anyone else. Because once the truth finally surfaced, there was no way to hide it again. The foundation had been there all along. The only difference was that people finally looked down and saw who had been holding it up.